Some crimes shock a community. Others leave behind questions so disturbing that they continue to echo years after the headlines fade. This is one of those cases. It began with what appeared to be an ordinary night out among friends on Long Island, New York. A young woman laughed, shared drinks, and made plans for the days ahead. By sunrise, she had vanished. Hours later, text messages from her phone suggested she was alive. Days later, investigators would discover that those messages only deepened the mystery. Then, nearly 40 miles away, across state lines in rural Connecticut, a gruesome discovery transformed a missing person investigation into one of the region's most disturbing homicide cases. The victim was 24-year-old Rebecca Becky Koster. Her murder would launch a painstaking investigation involving forensic science, digital evidence, witness testimony, and years of courtroom battles. Even after a conviction, the legal fight surrounding the case would continue, raising difficult questions about both justice and constitutional rights. But before the courtrooms, before the forensic evidence, before detectives pieced together her final hours, there was Rebecca herself. Rebecca Koster lived in Medford, a quiet community in Suffolk County on Long Island. Friends and family knew her simply as Becky. She worked as a home health aide, caring for autistic children and elderly patients, work that demanded patience, compassion, and trust. Those who knew her described someone who enjoyed helping others and spending time with the people she loved. Like many young adults in their 20s, she balanced work with evenings out with friends, looking forward to ordinary moments that often pass without a second thought. No one who saw Becky on the evening of December 3, 2009, could have imagined it would be the last night of her life. That Thursday evening began like countless others. Rebecca met up with friends and her boyfriend to enjoy a night out. The group visited several bars throughout Suffolk County, talking, laughing, and drinking together. As the night stretched into the early morning hours of December 4, they eventually arrived at Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill in Holbrook. It was there that another man entered Rebecca's story. His name was Evans Ganthier. According to prosecutors, Ganthier and Rebecca spoke inside the bar that night. At the time, their interaction appeared completely unremarkable. People meet strangers in bars every day. Nothing about that brief encounter suggested investigators would later spend years examining it in extraordinary detail. Eventually, the evening came to an end. Rebecca's boyfriend drove her home. By every account presented at trial, she safely arrived at her residence. For most people, that's where the story would have ended. Instead, investigators believe it was where another chapter quietly began. According to the prosecution, sometime after arriving home, Rebecca left again and met with Ganthier. Exactly why she left, exactly what happened next, and exactly where those final hours unfolded would become the central mystery of the investigation. There were no eyewitnesses who could describe everything that happened. There were no surveillance cameras capturing every moment. Instead, detectives would be forced to reconstruct those missing hours piece by piece, relying on forensic evidence, electronic records, and witness testimony. Morning arrived. Rebecca didn't answer calls. She didn't return home. As concern grew among those closest to her, something unusual happened. Text messages began arriving from Rebecca's cell phone. The messages suggested she was safe. They implied she wanted to be left alone. To family and friends desperately hoping for reassurance, those texts offered a brief moment of relief. Perhaps she simply needed time. Perhaps there was another explanation. But investigators would later argue those messages were never written by Rebecca. Instead, prosecutors alleged someone else had used her phone after her death to create the appearance that she had willingly disappeared. If true, it was more than deception. It was a calculated attempt to delay the investigation, while valuable evidence disappeared with every passing hour. As Rebecca remained missing, authorities launched an official search. Detectives interviewed friends. Family members retraced her recent movements. Investigators collected surveillance footage, examined phone records, and began reconstructing a timeline. At first, it was treated as a missing person case. Everyone hoped Rebecca would simply walk through the door. Instead, the investigation took a devastating turn. Several days later, authorities in North Stonington, Connecticut, made a horrifying discovery along a secluded rural road. Human remains had been found. The body had been dismembered and burned. The The condition of the remains suggested someone had made deliberate efforts to conceal the victim's identity and destroy evidence. Forensic specialists worked carefully to determine who the victim was. The answer shattered any remaining hope. The remains belonged to Rebecca Koster. The search was over. The homicide investigation had just begun. Detectives from New York and Connecticut now faced an enormous task. Someone had taken Rebecca's life. Someone had transported her remains across state lines. Someone had attempted to erase nearly every trace of the crime. But crimes rarely disappear completely. Every phone call, every surveillance camera, every text message, every mile driven, every microscopic piece of forensic evidence had the potential to reveal what happened during Rebecca's final hours. Investigators would soon discover that the answers weren't hidden in a single dramatic breakthrough. They were scattered across dozens of seemingly ordinary details. Individually, those details meant very little. Together, they would form the foundation of a murder case that would captivate Long Island, and years later, become the subject of intense legal scrutiny, because the deeper detectives looked into Rebecca Koster's final night. The more one name continued to emerge, and proving whether that connection was enough to convict would become the focus of one of Suffolk County's most closely watched murder trials. When detectives investigate a homicide, the first few days are often the most critical. Every hour that passes gives evidence an opportunity to disappear. Security footage is overwritten. Witnesses begin forgetting details. Cell phone data becomes harder to retrieve. And if someone is actively trying to cover their tracks, every passing minute can work in their favor. Rebecca Koster's killer had already made investigators' job extraordinarily difficult. Her remains had been transported across state lines. The body had been burned and dismembered in what prosecutors later argued was an attempt to destroy evidence and delay identification. But while physical evidence can be altered, digital evidence often tells a different story. And detectives quickly turned their attention to reconstructing Rebecca's final movements. The investigation became a meticulous exercise in rebuilding a timeline. Every person Rebecca had spoken with during her final evening was interviewed. Friends described the bars they had visited together. Employees and patrons were asked what they remembered. Surveillance footage was collected wherever possible. Nothing was considered too small. Investigators knew that even a seemingly insignificant observation could become the missing piece of a much larger puzzle. Among those interviews, one interaction stood out. Rebecca's encounter with Evans Ganthier at Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill. According to prosecutors, what initially appeared to be a brief conversation would ultimately become far more significant than anyone realized that night. Detectives began examining whether their contact had continued after Rebecca returned home. Cell phone records became one of the investigation's most valuable tools. Unlike human memory, electronic records leave timestamps. They document calls, text messages, location data, and patterns of communication. Investigators carefully analyzed Rebecca's phone activity during the hours surrounding her disappearance. Particular attention was paid to the text messages sent after family members realized she was missing. Those messages claimed Rebecca was safe, that she simply wanted to be left alone. To investigators, however, something didn't fit. Prosecutors would later argue that the messages were sent after Rebecca had already been killed. If that allegation were true, someone had used her phone to create a false timeline, one designed to convince family members she had disappeared voluntarily rather than becoming the victim of a violent crime. It was a chilling possibility, not only because it suggested planning, but because it demonstrated an awareness of how missing person investigations unfold. As detectives gathered electronic evidence, forensic teams continued processing every available crime scene. Rebecca's remains underwent extensive examination by medical experts. The condition of the body presented enormous challenges. Fire had destroyed valuable forensic evidence. Dismemberment complicated the examination. Even so, forensic investigators were able to recover information essential to the homicide investigation. Every finding helped narrow the sequence of events leading to Rebecca's death. At the same time, detectives executed search warrants connected to the investigation. Vehicles, residences, electronic devices, clothing. Each item was examined for trace evidence that might connect a suspect to the crime. Homicide investigations rarely hinge on one dramatic discovery. Instead, prosecutors build cases brick by brick. A witness statement here, a phone record there, DNA, fibers, vehicle movements. Each piece may appear insignificant on its own. Together, they can form a compelling narrative. As investigators assembled that narrative, one individual remained at the center of their attention: 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍. Authorities believed the evidence increasingly pointed in his direction. According to prosecutors, witness accounts, electronic records, and forensic findings supported the conclusion that 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙄 had been with Rebecca during her final hours. Investigators continued verifying every aspect of that timeline before taking the next major step. In any homicide investigation, an arrest marks the moment when suspicion gives way to formal accusation. But making an arrest without sufficient evidence risks jeopardizing the entire case. Detectives needed confidence that every piece of evidence could withstand intense scrutiny in court. Only then would prosecutors move forward. Eventually, authorities arrested 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙄𝙍 and charged him in connection with Rebecca Coster's murder. The arrest brought a measure of relief to Rebecca's family. For weeks, they had lived through unimaginable uncertainty. Now investigators believed they had identified the person responsible. But an arrest is never the end of a criminal investigation. It's the beginning of an entirely different battle. The burden now shifted to prosecutors. Every allegation would have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Every witness would be challenged. Every forensic finding would be examined. Every inconsistency, no matter how small, would be explored by the defense. And because the crime had involved multiple jurisdictions, a complex forensic investigation, and circumstantial as well as scientific evidence, the courtroom would become the place where every detail was tested. As news of the arrest spread across Long Island, public interest intensified. The brutality of the crime had already shocked the community. Now everyone wanted answers. What had happened after Rebecca left home? What motive could explain such violence? And could prosecutors prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions would soon be placed before 12 jurors. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution would present a carefully constructed timeline supported by forensic evidence, witness testimony, and digital records. The defense, however, would argue that the evidence left room for doubt. The trial would become a painstaking examination of every hour of Rebecca Coster's final night. And by the time both sides finished presenting their case, the jury would be asked to decide whether the evidence told one undeniable story or whether reasonable doubt still remained. By the time the case reached the courtroom, nearly 4 years had passed since Rebecca Coster disappeared. The investigation had consumed thousands of hours. Detectives had interviewed witnesses, analyzed phone records, executed search warrants, and gathered forensic evidence from multiple jurisdictions. Now, every decision they had made would be scrutinized before a jury. The prosecution's burden was clear: to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙄𝙍 had murdered Rebecca Coster. The defense had no obligation to prove who committed the crime. Its responsibility was far simpler and often just as powerful: raise reasonable doubt. From the beginning of the trial, prosecutors laid out a carefully constructed timeline. They argued that Rebecca's final known movements, combined with witness testimony, digital evidence, and forensic findings, pointed overwhelmingly toward 𝙇𝙇𝙄𝙍. Jurors heard how Rebecca had spent the evening with friends before arriving at 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙍𝙄𝙍 bar and grill. They learned about her encounter with 𝙇𝙇𝙄𝙍. They heard evidence that prosecutors said placed the two together during Rebecca's final hours. But chronology alone doesn't prove murder. It was what allegedly happened afterward that became the heart of the prosecution's case. One of the most compelling aspects of the trial involved Rebecca's cell phone. Jurors heard evidence about the messages sent after she had disappeared. To her loved ones, those texts had initially offered hope. They suggested she was alive, safe, simply wanting to be left alone. Prosecutors argued those messages were part of a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators and delay the missing person investigation. According to the state's case, Rebecca could not have sent those messages herself. Instead, prosecutors alleged someone else used her phone after her death to create the illusion that she had voluntarily disappeared. If the jury accepted that theory, the messages became more than electronic communication. They became evidence of consciousness of guilt. The jury also heard testimony about the condition in which Rebecca's remains were discovered. Because of the sensitive nature of the evidence, prosecutors focused on what investigators believed those actions demonstrated rather than dwelling on graphic details. According to the prosecution, the efforts made to conceal Rebecca's identity and dispose of her remains showed planning after the killing rather than panic. The state argued that whoever committed the crime took deliberate steps to make identification difficult and frustrate the investigation. For jurors, those allegations painted a picture not only of violence, but of an extensive effort to avoid accountability. Throughout the proceedings, forensic experts explained the scientific evidence collected during the investigation. Investigators described how they reconstructed Rebecca's final movements. Digital analysts discussed phone records and timelines. Law enforcement witnesses walked jurors through the months-long investigation that ultimately led to 𝙇𝙇𝙄𝙍's arrest. Each witness contributed another piece to the prosecution's narrative. No single witness claimed to have seen the murder. Instead, prosecutors relied on what is known as a circumstantial case, one built from many independent facts that, when viewed together, were argued to point to one conclusion. Circumstantial evidence is legally recognized and can support a conviction if a jury finds it proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution maintained that, taken together, the evidence left no reasonable alternative explanation. The defense challenged that conclusion. Defense attorneys questioned aspects of the investigation and argued that the prosecution had failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. They challenged portions of the state's timeline and the interpretation of certain evidence. As in many criminal trials, the defense emphasized that suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not enough for a conviction. The jury's decision, they argued, had to rest solely on evidence proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom became a battle between competing interpretations of the same facts. Every witness was cross-examined. Every timeline was questioned. Every piece of evidence was carefully examined. For days, jurors listened, took notes, and quietly observed as both sides attempted to persuade them. Finally, after weeks of testimony, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution urged jurors to look at the evidence as a complete picture, rather than isolated pieces. They argued that the digital records, witness testimony, forensic findings, and Rebecca's disappearance formed a single, consistent narrative. The defense reminded jurors that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state. If any reasonable doubt remained, they argued, the law required an acquittal. Then the case was placed in the hands of 12 jurors. Behind closed doors, they reviewed weeks of testimony, thousands of pages of evidence, dozens of exhibits, and the immense responsibility of determining whether the prosecution had met its burden. The jury ultimately found 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍 guilty of the charges brought against him. For Rebecca's family, the verdict marked the end of years of uncertainty. Although no court decision could undo what had happened, they finally heard a jury declare someone criminally responsible for Rebecca's death. In 2013, 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍 was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To many observers, the case appeared closed. The investigation was complete. The trial had ended. Justice, it seemed, had been delivered. But in the American legal system, a guilty verdict is not always the final chapter. Every convicted defendant has the right to appeal. Years later, those appeals would produce an extraordinary legal development, one that would reopen questions many believed had already been answered. For Rebecca Coster's family, the guilty verdict represented something they had waited years to hear. A jury had listened to weeks of testimony, reviewed the evidence, and concluded that 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍 was responsible for Rebecca's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To the public, it appeared the case was finally over. But in the American justice system, even the most serious convictions can face years of appellate review. Appeals are not retrials. They don't ask whether a defendant is guilty or innocent. Instead, appellate courts examine whether the trial itself complied with the Constitution and the law. Sometimes convictions are upheld. Sometimes they are overturned because of legal errors that may have affected the fairness of the proceedings. Rebecca Coster's case would eventually become one of those rare instances where the legal process continued long after the verdict. Following his conviction, 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍 pursued multiple appeals through the state and federal courts. His attorneys argued that constitutional violations had occurred during the investigation and trial. Years after the jury returned its verdict, a federal judge reviewed the case through a habeas corpus petition, a legal process that allows federal courts to examine whether a state conviction violated constitutional rights. After reviewing the record, the federal court concluded that constitutional errors had occurred and vacated 𝘾𝙃𝙄𝙇𝙄𝙍's conviction. The ruling did not declare him factually innocent, nor did it determine that Rebecca Coster had not been murdered. Instead, it found that the legal process leading to the conviction had been constitutionally flawed, requiring further legal proceedings. For Rebecca's loved ones, it was another painful chapter in a case they believed had already reached its conclusion. For legal scholars, it became a reminder that the justice system is designed not only to determine guilt, but also to ensure convictions are obtained through procedures that satisfy constitutional protections. Justice demands accountability. It also demands fairness. Sometimes those two principles exist in difficult tension. More than a decade has passed since Rebecca Coster lost her life. The headlines have faded. The television cameras are gone. But for the people who loved her, time did not erase the loss. Rebecca was more than a victim in a courtroom. She was a daughter, a friend, a caregiver, a young woman whose life ended far too soon. Cases like Rebecca's remind us that every homicide leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind birthdays that are never celebrated, empty chairs at family gatherings, conversations that never happen, lives forever divided into two chapters, before and after. While the legal proceedings surrounding this case have continued, one truth has never changed. Rebecca Coster never came home, and her story continues to be remembered by those who refuse to let her become just another forgotten name. If you found this documentary informative and want to see more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified facts and real court records, subscribe to Whispered Pages. New documentaries explore some of history's most compelling criminal cases with respect for the victims, attention to the evidence, and a commitment to factual storytelling. Because behind every case is a story that deserves to be remembered.